Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz. Haider. This program comes to you from the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research. A word about CESPA. It is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments. As you know, this program is part of that effort. And today's episode, we're going to discuss the tech war between China and the United States. For this, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Miller. Miller is Associate Professor of International History at Tufts University and the author, most recently, of Chip War, the fight for the world's most critical technology. Miller's research focuses on technology, geopolitics, economics, international affairs, and Russia. He has written 3 books previously on Russia, including Putinomics, Power and Money in Resurgent Russia. So what exactly is this chip war? Why exactly is the chip or the semiconductor so crucial to modern tech? And why does Miller argue, as he does in his book, that the rivalry between the United States and China may well be determined by computing power? So chip is determining the structure of the world economy and the balance of military power, in essence, shaping the international politics and peer competition between the US and China. So for the US, the biggest threat is its military application, because chips are everywhere in military and aerospace sector. They're used in manufacturing numerous devices and systems such as communication and navigation systems, safety equipment, engine and flight control systems, missile systems, avionics, and advancements in artificial intelligence. And they make bombs smart and smarter. And therefore, China cannot be allowed to catch up. The US itself and its allies are spending billions on R&D into hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, including its military applications, processing, cloud computing, etc., etc. And now that the US has placed sanctions on Chinese companies to starve China of cutting-edge chip technology, what will be its impact on chip-making supply chain maintained by some of America's closest allies? How will China react? And how long will it take for China to catch up? So let's pull in Chris at this point. Chris, thank you so much. So I was, when I was prepping for this program, I came across this article in MIT Technology Review. Anyway, this last question that I talked about how China is going to react to this, and it seems that they are responding. So this is from last month. And the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, according to this report, announced a new export license system for gallium and germanium, 2 elements that are used to make computer chips, fiber optics, solar cells, and other such tech devices. And according to the report, most experts see this move as China's most significant retaliation against the West semiconductor tech blockade. So I just wanted to, start with this and get your perspective on where this thing is headed. And then, of course, we are also going to talk about your book. And for the viewers, here's the book that I was talking about. It's an excellent book at various levels, and we're going to talk about this also. But let's begin with China's retaliation, Chris.
Well, we've seen China take a number of different steps in retaliation. They've banned the sale of certain foreign companies' chips into China, but they've also, as you said, put new controls on the export of certain minerals like gallium and germanium abroad. Thus far, the controls don't seem to be imposed in a very tight fashion. There's a new regulatory regime that has been set up as part of this new control, but it doesn't seem to have substantially reduced the amount of gallium and germanium that reach global markets. So it's more of a threat right now, a threat that these controls could be tightened in the future, rather than a serious effort to disrupt the world's electronic industry. And I think the reason for that is because these controls, if China were to tighten them dramatically, would be a very blunt weapon. They would hurt the United States, they would hurt Japan, they would hurt Europe, but they'd also hurt China, because China actually assembles and consumes many of the goods that have gallium and germanium in them. And there's no easy way for China to stop gallium just going to one country or to 2 countries, because once it reaches the global market, it can be easily sold abroad. So this is a threat that retaliation could be ratcheted up in the future. But thus far, it's not being enforced in a way that is imposing substantial costs on tech companies or on the United States.
Right. So basically, more of a signal of where things might be headed, rather than actually, actualizing the thing itself. And I understand your point that it will hurt China itself also. But here's the thing: when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, one of the things that China did was to sanction some of the imports from Taiwan. But one of the things that it did not sanction, and rightly so, because that's the rational approach, was semiconductors, because that would be shooting oneself in the foot. Now, you talk about the supply chain in the book, and some of the companies that, the top companies in the supply chain. Now, how would Taiwan be looking at this, or South Korea, for instance, in terms of their exports of semiconductors into China? Because it seems that while they understand America's motives, they're not particularly, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're not particularly happy with this decision by, the sanctions decision by the United States.
I think you find all companies in the chip industry want to be able to sell to as many customers as possible. That's true for Taiwanese, Korean, Japanese, American companies. And so whenever their ability to sell to customers is restricted, they complain. And that's certainly true of the Taiwanese and Korean companies that you mentioned. It's also true, though, that when you look at where Taiwanese firms like TSMC, the world's biggest chip producer, Korea's big memory producers, where they sell chips, they largely sell in markets where they're one of a small number of players, or in some cases where they're the only player in the world with their type of technology. And so when you look at the relationship between Taiwan and China, or Korea and China, when it comes to semiconductors, China has very little leverage because it needs these countries' chips, and it has no alternatives to buying them from abroad because these chips are too complex to be made in China itself. And what that's meant is that actually the US controls have not had a major financial cost on Taiwanese or Korean firms because they've been able to keep their volume of sales roughly the same. If China can't buy them, other countries will, because demand for these chips is just so immense.
Right. So some of this technology, for instance, the Taiwanese TSMC, well, you've got Samsung also, but let's talk about ASML, the photolithography, which, seems like the Dutch are almost the sole, inventors of those machines, if you will, and the use of those machines. So when you talk about in your book about China, if I remember correctly, trailing behind by about 8 to 10 years in terms of, the cutting edge chip making, is it possible? Because, the process, as you've described, is like from theory to innovation to engineering to marketing and the supply chains. And it is the single most expensive industry in terms of, if you bring all its components together, from conception right down to marketing, with photolithography and, packaging and the rest of it, fabrication thrown in. If the worst came to the worst, I mean, we are speculating, China has the capital. Do you think that, how long could it possibly take them to sort of put all of this together and move from trailing edge to cutting edge part of chip making?
Well, the challenge China faces right now is that when it comes to the semiconductor supply chain, at every step, the software tools that are used to design chips, the design of chips themselves, the machine tools that are used to manufacture chips, like the lithography machines that you mentioned, the ultra purified chemicals that are required in the manufacturing process, at all of those steps, of which there are many that are involved in chip making, China has zero cutting edge capacity at any of those steps. It relies fundamentally on imports from the Netherlands, from the US, from Japan, from Taiwan, and from Korea to satisfy all of those steps. So China is actually a long way behind that capability. Today, there's no country that can on its own produce cutting edge chips. The closest countries would be United States or Japan, which have a larger share of cutting edge production than any other country. But across the supply chain, China is far behind at every single step. And this is not simply a problem that money alone can solve, because if money could solve it, China would have already addressed the issue. The reality is, since 2014, when Chinese President Xi Jinping first identified semiconductors as what he calls a core technology, China's been putting tens of billions of dollars each year into trying to domesticate advanced chip making capabilities, and it's failed. And it's failed both because it's very, very hard, but also because there's no industry that advances more rapidly. And this is the third aspect that's critical to realize. The cutting edge in chip making doesn't stand still. It improves more rapidly than any industry has in all of human history. It doubles its capacity every single 2 years. And so
Moore's law. In fact, sorry, I intervened into what you're saying, but just for the viewers, like, in fact, it's getting faster and faster. It's kind of even faster than Moore's law itself. So please go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, and that makes catching up to the cutting edge so extraordinarily difficult, because you're not trying to catch up to a stationary definition of the cutting edge. You're catching up to something that's changing rapidly every year or two, which is why China's made approximately no progress in catching up over the last decade. If you look at the most advanced capabilities at SMIC, the leading Chinese chip maker, versus the capabilities at TSMC, the leading Taiwanese chip maker, the gap between them is the same today as it was 10 years ago.
Right. Now, the reason I asked this question and I'm pressing this point is because you yourself, and let me quote from your book, you talk about how important this is for China. And you mentioned that in August 2020, when USS Mustin was sailing through the Taiwanese Strait, and the People's Liberation Army had announced a retaliatory series of live fire exercises. But you go on to say that on this particular day, China's leaders worried less about the US Navy and more about an obscure US Commerce Department regulation called the Entity List. And then you go on to say the target was Huawei, China's tech giant. And you further mentioned that the company's global expansion ground to a halt. Now, this is the kind of scenario which at a number of, sort of levels, not just the military application, but also the commercial and various other 5G technologies and the rest of it, is something that has the potential to hurt China badly and is in fact hurting China. So clearly, there's got to be, if it is worrying the Chinese so much, they are going to do something about it. And given your research across 3 continents and, speaking to a number of people, what could that possibly be?
Well, we've seen China take a 2-pronged strategy thus far. The first has been to retaliate in some of the ways that you mentioned, to raise the costs of the United States of any sort of future escalations. But the primary strategy has been to continue pouring large sums of money into the Chinese chip industry. And the goal is that if Chinese firms face no difficulty raising money, if there's lots of government provided capital, they'll be able to make the investments that are needed to advance technologically. And in some ways, this is working. We certainly see a vast increase in chip making capacity in China that's being coming online right now, the next couple of years. But most of this capacity is happening at lagging edges, technologies that were invented 10 or 20 years ago. None of it's happening at the cutting edge, because those are spheres in which China simply can't access the tools you need for cutting edge production. And so China's betting that if it keeps pouring in money, it's not only going to get this big build out in mature technologies, older types of chips, but also it's going to have an environment in which its companies will innovate more successfully than they have in the past. Now, I think this is probably not going to work, but it's not certain. And it's possible that Chinese companies manage to do better than I or most of the rest of the industry suspect.
Right. So anyway, in your book, obviously, you trace the history of, the evolution of all this. And one thing that comes out very clearly is that some of the best minds, I mean, there are a number of these Nobel laureates um, who were thinking about these things, who were conceptualizing, as I said, from theory to innovation to engineering. And so it did not happen overnight, clearly. And now it has acquired its own pace. And there is, of course, there is a lot of past experience behind all this, whether it's with reference to companies in the US, in Taiwan, and ASML in Holland, Samsung and the others in South Korea and the rest. Uh, and of course, lest we forget the mention of Soviet Union / Russia in trying to copy that, which obviously, and as you mentioned, that you just simply cannot copy this. You got to innovate yourself. So therefore, it seems to me that the Chinese, and again, I'm speculating, the Chinese would want to hone the trailing edge, chip making technologies, also trying to innovate and start moving towards the cutting edge ones. And yet the problem being that since cutting edge is not stationary and is moving very fast, so if China were to reach what the US, the Taiwanese are making today in the year of the Lord 2023, by 2026, let's say, the technology would have moved ahead another 4 to 5 years. So this is like a constant attempt at catching up, but not being able to do that unless something happens. I don't know how it's going to happen, but let me allied question here. I'm also expressing my own sort of loud thoughts, because when I was reading the book, I was thinking of whenever I get to speak with you, I'd sort of mention my own thoughts on this. Is stealing this technology possible?
Well, I think we've seen lots of efforts at stealing over the past several decades. There's now a series of court cases between different companies in different countries alleging intellectual property theft. And what you find in almost all of those cases is that it's not enough. So, for example, TSMC, the leading Taiwanese firm, has repeatedly sued SMIC, the leading Chinese firm, over intellectual property issues. Some of these have been settled in ways that make it appear that SMIC is admitting that it was in fact stealing intellectual property, but that hasn't done anything to help SMIC catch up. And the reason is that the chip making process is so complex that there's not a single person in the world who understands how all of it works, because people need to specialize in each one of the process steps and spend years of their lives understanding each one of them. And so even within a company like TSMC, there's not one document you can download that tells you how to make a chip. It's built into the organization. It's in the know-how of all the brains of the engineers. And so it's simply not something you can copy and paste onto into a file and steal from any company. And that's why copying has proven such a difficult strategy to pursue. We do know, going back to the Soviet period that you mentioned, when the Soviet Union was trying to copy chips that were made in the US and Japan during the Cold War, the Soviet Union did succeed in copying older generation chips. But the problem was that by the time they figured out how to copy, it took years to do, and they were, again, finding themselves far behind the cutting edge. So copying was only barely possible, and where it was done, it was not an effective strategy.
Right. So in that sense, it's very different from nuclear technology, for instance. Like the US obviously was the one that tested the first nuclear weapon. They also were the one first test the thermonuclear weapon, and also developed tactical nuclear weapons, thinking all the time that the Soviet Union will not be able to catch up, but they did. Surprisingly much faster than the US intelligence estimates are. But this seems to be a totally different ball game altogether.
Well, I think that's right. And people often think that nuclear weapons are complex and hard to make. But the reality is that nuclear technology has basically not changed for half a century. The design of
Right.
them is basically the same. And
It has basically reached its upper limit in terms of technology itself. Now, of course, you can miniaturize and you can develop hypersonic missiles and the rest of it, and make them much smarter exactly by using these chips. But that's a separate issue altogether. So, in which case, hypothetically speaking, if China were to, and I'm not talking about China taking over Taiwan, but China were to take over TSMC, in a corporate takeover, it would still not be fully, in terms of understanding everything that happens at various levels of chip making and its supply chain.
that's right. And even TSMC, which is the world's leading chip maker, is still fundamentally dependent on importing manufacturing equipment from Japan, from the United States, and from the Netherlands. Taiwan produces almost none of it domestically. And so Taiwan is an absolutely critical node in the supply chain, but it's not an independent player. It's deeply interlinked with the US, with Japan, and with the Netherlands.
Right. Which takes me to what you have written in the book, and in great detail with respect to supply chains, with respect to American innovators and entrepreneurs finding that labor in Southeast Asia was much cheaper. There were no unions. There was not that kind of trouble. And despite having lost in Vietnam for a number of reasons, including this whole supply chain, that the US emerges as a winner. So I would want you to sort of, throw some light on that. And the other thing that I want you to sort of inform our viewers about is, given the vast distances, how is it that this supply chain is still so cost effective?
Well, the distances have been overcome because chips are very small and very high value. So they're easy to ship, both via maritime shipping, but also increasingly by air freight. And if you're talking about a chip that can be the size of your fingernail, but sold for dozens of dollars, or in some cases even hundreds of dollars, the cost of air freight is nothing relative to making sure you've got the most efficient supply chain. And East Asia has played a major role in chip supply chains all the way since the early 1960s, right when the first chips were being invented. And there's been an interesting alliance that's been informally struck between the United States and US tech firms and East and Southeast Asian governments and their companies that has bound them together. From the US perspective, East Asia has provided cost-effective assembly and production and has been bought into the US dominated world order. And from the perspective of East Asian governments, they've been protected by the fact that they have absolutely critical nodes in US supply chains. And they've gotten technology transfer as part of the process and have been able to move up the value chain. So if you look, for example, at the position that Singapore or Taiwan or Korea plays today in the world economy relative to the role they played 50 years ago, it's completely transformed. And one of the key industries that helped these countries transform their economic position was semiconductors. So this mutual interdependence, mutual benefits from the chip industry has been what's bound these countries so closely together over the past half century. And the big change right now is that for a time, it seemed like China was on a similar path, assembling many of the smartphones and computers and servers that were part of US tech supply chains. But now it's clear that this is being bifurcated into a Chinese tech sphere and a non-Chinese tech sphere. And this is the primary change, not just to tech supply chains, but I think to the world economy that we're seeing right now.
Right. So during the pandemic and post-pandemic, one of the big conversations was about disruption of supply chains. And there was, there's some thought about either creating redundancies or onshoring. Is that something that happened in the semiconductor sector also, or no? The supply chains were found to be fine.
Well, the chip industry did face some shortages during the pandemic, but it also showed that it was quite resilient in its current structure. We actually produced globally more chips in 2020 than we did in 2019, despite all of the disruptions of the pandemic in many different countries. And so, in some ways, the chip industry was one of the best performers in the pandemic. But what we also saw was that as every year passes, more and more parts of the world economy become dependent on semiconductors. And so today, it's not just smartphones or computers, it's almost every manufactured good has chips inside of it. For example, a new car will often have 1,000 semiconductors inside,
Yeah.
produced by 100 different companies. And if you're missing just one of those chips, your car might not function. And so we saw huge disruptions to other segments of the economy during the pandemic because they couldn't get all of the chips that they need. And as every year passes, more and more parts of the world economy need larger and larger numbers of silicon chips.
Right. So you talked about the world sort of, divvying up into the Chinese tech sector with China's allies and the US. Something similar is also, broadly speaking, happening in terms of, like the old neoliberal trading architecture, kind of giving way to what Edward Luttwak and Blackbill talked about, geoeconomics, where you use economics for geopolitical ends. Uh, so you sort of flagged the point about its impact on global economy. But if it actually comes down to that, how do you think it's going to impact uh, the chip industry itself? And because, I mean, China may be trailing behind, but it packages and, sort of makes phones and a number of other devices that have chips in them. So would this then require a major reconfiguration of things, manufacturing as well as supply chains?
Well, it does. And I think we're already seeing this beginning to happen. If you look over the past 24 months, we've seen a series of announcements of smartphone, computer, server, consumer electronics assemblers moving assembly capacity out of China to Vietnam, to Thailand, to other countries in Southeast Asia, to Mexico, and to some extent to India as well. And so no single country can replace China in terms of its role in electronics assembly. But I think we're headed towards a world in which China plays a much less dominant role in assembly. And there is much more assembly capacity for electronic devices in a number of other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. And the whole world spent the last several decades investing billions and billions of dollars a year in China for electronics assembly. And so this is a process that's not going to change overnight. But if you talk to tech firms, not just US tech firms, but Japanese electronics companies, Korean, Taiwanese, you find that all of them are trying to pursue a strategy of building up non-Chinese sources of assembly because they're all preparing for a world in which tech supply chains are increasingly bifurcated. They're not necessarily excited about this world. It involves costs to them for investing in new ways, but everyone in the tech and electronics world takes this as the new normal, and they're changing their investment patterns because of it.
Right. So, given your expertise and your research in this area, if you were advising China with respect to how the situation is unfolding, what would you propose? I mean, copying, stealing, as we just talked about, you mentioned it in your book also, that's not going to work. Then we have the problem of, literally doubling of Moore's law in terms of the pace at which things are changing. So, what could China do to sort of have some kind of offset strategy?
Well, if you look at what Taiwan and Korea did as they were trying to catch up technologically, their strategy was to integrate very deeply into international supply chains, and especially US and Japanese supply chains. And the irony is that for a long time, that was actually China's strategy. You had a largely private sector tech industry in China that was pretty successful in integrating itself in international supply chains, selling to foreign companies, acquiring components, and facing, until very recently, very few restrictions on what it could buy. I think what you find is that Chinese politics has actually driven major shifts and made this strategy now impossible. Both because domestically the Chinese government has cracked down on its private tech companies in a big way over the past couple of years, but also because China's foreign policy has induced a lot of the new restrictions that the U.S. and Japan in particular are leading. And so I think the optimal strategy for China is no longer a politically viable strategy, given the decisions that China's leaders have made. And now it's a question of, can China pursue a second best strategy that is remotely viable? And I think the strategy that China is pursuing is a plausible one if you're willing to spend huge sums of money and risk having that money be wasted. Perhaps all the money that China is spending right now will lead to some advances. It's a possibility. The risk, however, is that all of the money China is spending essentially produces nothing of value, that China builds lots of new chip making facilities, but they all end up being less efficient than Taiwan, and that no one buys them except for companies in China that are forced to buy from them. And if that outcome is what we get from the current strategy, it's going to be immensely costly. So China's taking a big gamble right now. There's a chance that its strategy of pouring money into its chip industry produces some advances. There's also a chance, I think a higher chance, that it ends up producing really substantial economic costs for China in the long run.
Right. So at best, it's a suboptimal strategy, and the way I see it, and correct me if I've got it wrong, but it seems to me that the various levels at which this entire thing happens, from theoretical conception to miniaturization to nano whatever, it's just mind boggling, just the number of zeros that you see. Everyone, unless you are plugged into the chain, you are useless. I mean, no one. I mean, the US itself cannot on its own do the cutting edge chip technology, because it is reliant on a number of other processes, including the ASML, for instance, photolithography, and the stuff that ASMC does. ASML cannot do what they do if someone in the United States or in South Korea is not conceptualizing and innovating and designing the whole thing. Someone else is fabricating the stuff. So all of it is kind of, it seems to me, so mixed that you simply cannot, you can't pull out different strands of it. And no strand on its own can actually stand on its own. Have I got that right?
That's right. And the best example of this is actually Russia's military. We've found over the past 18 months of war between Russia and Ukraine, there's been great open source studies done of Russian military equipment that's been captured in the battlefields. And what you find when you take apart the microelectronics is that Russian military equipment is full of chips made in Japan, in the United States, in Korea, and in Taiwan. In fact, all of the world's militaries rely on the exact same semiconductor supply chain. Some purchase legally, some have no choice but to smuggle in these chips, but there's not a single military that's not reliant on this semiconductor supply chain, because it's the only one in the world capable of producing cutting edge chips.
Right. So essentially, it's going to be a tough, really tough for China to play catch up, unless it can somehow get replugged into this very supply chain, which is in a way dominated by the United States and its allies. So that's essentially the bottom line of this.
That's correct.
But before I go for the closing, since we've done a lot of work on Russia, as I mentioned in my opening also, what is your sense of the Russo-Ukraine war in terms of do you think that the Kremlin, or shall I say Putin himself, has been able to achieve, if not everything that he wanted, but some of it as far as his military venture is concerned?
I think if you listen to the speeches that President Putin gave in February 21st and February 24th of 2022, right as the war was beginning, and compare that to the aims that were stated in those speeches to what Russia's accomplished today, you find that Russia's accomplished only a small fraction of its goals. The initial goal appears to have been to topple the Ukrainian government, which of course has not happened and looks unlikely to happen. I think also you find that Russia's paid a much, much higher cost than it expected to pay in terms of casualties in its forces, in terms of military equipment, in terms of an expansion of NATO, now including Finland and soon of Sweden, and in terms of hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million Russians leaving the country, fleeing military conscription. These are all costs that Russia wasn't expecting to pay. And so I think that if Russian leaders were to answer the question honestly, they would admit that the benefits have been much lower and the costs have been much higher than they expected. That doesn't mean they're willing to give up. I don't think, quite the contrary. But it certainly hasn't been nearly as successful as they'd anticipated.
Well, it could possibly be gambling for resurrection also, because I mean, in the longer term, if they're dug in now. The Ukrainian counteroffensive, for a number of reasons, and I just wrote an article on this, for a number of reasons is kind of bogged down. It's more tactical rather than a theater level or a scale level combined arms offensive. So if this means keeping Ukraine unstable, that itself can be argued as one of the goals, not the optimal one, because capturing Kyiv and installing a government there would have been the optimal choice, because then Putin could have negotiated with the West, but that did not happen. So short of that, keeping Ukraine unstable, and while not allowing the Ukrainian armed forces to actually recapture or regain territories that they've lost, could seem to be, one of those choices that one could argue could be sold to the Russian public.
I think that's certainly how Russian leaders see it today.
Yeah, well, you obviously know that Yevgeny Prigozhin seems to have died in mysterious circumstances. So it seems that a lot has not changed in Russia so far. But Chris Bella, thank you so much for being on the program. It was great listening to you. And as I said that, while I was reading the book, I was, thinking loudly to myself, thinking, at some point, if I get to talk to you, then I'll, try and get some clarifications. But grateful. And let's hope that we can have another sitting on perhaps Russia at some point.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.